Thank you for joining us today at the Wilson Center. As a congressionally chartered institution, we're proud to be scholarship-driven and fiercely nonpartisan. My name is Tim Eidelnant, and I'm a Department of State scholar here at the Wilson Center. Today, I'm honored to welcome Michal Kotler-Wunsch, Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism, and a former member of the Knesset, Israeli Parliament. Michal is a distinguished public speaker and policy advisor specializing in law, human rights, and combating anti-Semitism. During her time in the Knesset, she chaired the subcommittee on the Israel diaspora relations, served on key committees, including foreign affairs and security, and co-founded the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism. She continues to lead critical initiatives to combat anti-Semitism worldwide. Before we delve into today's discussion on combating anti-Semitism, it's important to briefly address the current situation in Israel. So, Michal, I'd like to begin by asking for your perspective on the recent release of hostages, the ceasefire, and what this moment means for the state of Israel. And then following this, we'll turn to our main topic, the Israeli government's global efforts to combat anti-Semitism, including in the field of education, addressing hate on social media, and fostering international collaboration. This discussion is especially timely as it will air on January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day for reflection and renewed commitment to combating hate and anti-Semitism. Michal, thank you for joining us today here at the Wilson Center.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to the Wilson Center and to whoever has tuned in to this conversation. It is a very important moment, as you mentioned, as we mark 88 years to the end of World War II, in which we all committed to the notion of never again. And when I contextualize that with your first question as to what it is that's happened in Israel and the release of 3 women, Romi and Doron and Emily, who were stolen from their beds on October the 7th and have been released, I'm going to say in exchange, because it's an Orwellian exchange, for 90 attempted murderers that were released actually into Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. What I want to make very clear is it's just another symptom of what we will delve into more deeply in what I would regard as what happened, not as negotiations that paved their path to a deal, so to speak, but actually an extortion not only of the state of Israel and the Jewish people that have suffered the worst attack since the Holocaust on October the 7th, and then a multi-front war openly intent to annihilate the state of Israel by proxies of a genocidal Islamic regime in Iran, but also extortion of what I will try and sort of posit in my analysis of anti-Semitism, that is extortion of the free world, extortion that demands the understanding that we are in the midst of what I would call the war of barbarism against our shared civilization that actually undermines the foundations of all of our democracies. And that is the nature of the existential moment that I believe that we are in, of which Israel is just on the front lines of, if you will.
Thank you, Michal. Last week, we started an initiative here at the Wilson Center to really look at the issue of anti-Semitism and how governments around the world are combating anti-Semitism. So we hosted a discussion, as you know, with special envoys and senior officials from governments around the world. They spoke about different barriers governments face in addressing anti-Semitism, from legal and judicial barriers to the way the term itself is being manipulated in electoral propaganda, for example, with elections coming up in a number of countries in 2025. So this is a complex environment that raises serious challenges. You, in your position as Israeli Special Envoy, travel around the world and meet quite a few people, including here in the United States. From your perspective, what do you see as the most significant obstacles that governments around the world face as far as combating anti-Semitism, and how are they addressed, or how can these challenges be addressed most effectively?
So I'll say, and of course, alongside my colleagues with whom you spoke last week, and many of them around the world have been in this role as special envoys for combating anti-Semitism, representing their countries, the United States, Canada, South America, European countries, and so on, Australia, of course, the understanding that what we have seen since the October 7th massacre, which, as I mentioned, was the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust, what we have seen around the world in all of their constituencies is a tsunami of anti-Semitism, as I believe they shared with you the hundreds of percentages rise of anti-Semitic attacks that have been not just mainstreamed and normalized, but have received or have been received with very ineffective responses. And I'll say, as Israel's Special Envoy for combating anti-Semitism, and I should mention I am sort of late to join this group of special envoy, this coalition of special envoys. Israel appointed myself, Israel's second special envoy, in fact, only 3 weeks before October the 7th. And I have since indeed been traveling around the world as Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. What has been most pronounced since October the 7th, which I have said over and over and over again, was fueled by the very same anti-Semitism that fueled the responses to October the 7th, to the war crimes, to the crimes against humanity perpetrated on that day. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that because I believe that's the greatest hurdle to answer your question. Responses of silence, responses of denial, responses of justification, responses of attacks of Jews as late as yesterday and torching of a childcare center in Sydney, Australia. But of course, not only there, in Montreal, in Amsterdam, in Washington, the only kosher restaurant actually whose windows were smashed on the anniversary of Kristallnacht. The understanding that what we have seen in the last 16 months is the dangerous mainstreaming of anti-Semitism is perhaps the biggest challenges that all of my colleagues around the world, and I will argue all of the countries and places and spaces in which anti-Semitism is festering, spreading, infecting, face together. And, you know, I quote the late Rabbi Sachs, who said that the most reliable sign of a rising threat to humanity and freedom and the dignity of difference is anti-Semitism. And I'd like to share perhaps where I differ from some of the accounts that you received last week, in that I am not a historian. I am a lawyer, I am a free speech and human rights expert. I come from a field that I believe is the field that enabled the mainstreaming of this strain of anti-Semitism. And I'd like to share a little bit my analysis of that, how that has happened, because I believe that our focus on what has happened again and again, devastating as it is, including the October 7th massacre, is not the way that we can prevent recurrence, meaning the understanding that never again a prospective commitment must remember what happened in order to understand and identify the threats in the present so we can prevent recurrence in the future. Precisely recurrence of which happened on October the 7th is my understanding, or my understanding of my responsibility, I'll say. And the notion that it is the very international institutions, mechanisms, principles that were systematically hijacked and weaponized in order to enable the mutation of anti-Semitism, an ever mutating virus that latches on to the guiding social construct of the time, be it religion, be it science, or be it the secular religion of our times, human rights, is what's most important to me. To be able to prevent, to be able to say never again, we have to understand how this happened and not just what happened. And so when I sort of assess the unconventional war for public opinion that was waged against the state of Israel in the UN, the very institution that was created, mandated, entrusted to ensure that never again. I begin very often with a 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution. We will be marking 50 years to that resolution, I believe in November. A resolution that then US ambassador to the UN, Patrick Moynihan, understood for the Orwellian inversion of fact and law that it would allow. He understood then and was outraged then that if Zionism is racism and Nazism is racism, then it won't take long before Zionism will be deemed as Nazism. And here we are, fast forward 50 years later in 2025, on every university campus, protest encampments and the streets around the world. So Zionism is racism, blood libel number one. Blood libel number two, the 2001 Conference Against Racism in Durban, that turned into an anti-Semitic hate fest and launched the next blood libel of Israel's an apartheid state. 2001 led to now 24 years of Israel apartheid weeks across campuses around the world, in the United States included. And finally, the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law, the hijacking and weaponization of genocide itself, a term coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family was annihilated in Auschwitz, to accuse the state of Israel in the International Court of Justice by none other than South Africa of perpetrating genocide that has actually a very clear definition demanding intent, then endorsed by human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, that redefine genocide so that they can accuse the state of Israel of perpetrating the worst crime known to mankind or to humankind, then utilized by countries like Ireland, like Spain, that will join and jump on the bandwagon. Now, if we don't understand that that is the process that has enabled the mutation that demonizes and delegitimizes and applies double standards, whether it's to the individual Jew, barring them from an equal place in society, or the Jewish nation state, the proverbial Jew among the nations, barring it from an equal place in the family of nations, then we cannot identify and combat this strain of anti-Semitism that I will call anti-Zionism, or the denial of Israel's very right to exist in any borders, which October the 7th meant to make very clear. And actually, we hear since this alleged ceasefire over and over again, the intent to perpetrate 10/7 or October 7th again and again. And we cannot identify and combat what it is that fueled and enabled it, i.e. the mechanism, the demonization and the delegitimization and the double standards. And that, for me, is the greatest challenge that actually underscores the imperative for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. I know you discussed it. I know that Andy Baker discussed its history at length. We have to be very clear. The IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, the result of a long democratic process that was adopted by more than 40 countries and then recommitted to, if you will, in the global guidelines for combating anti-Semitism that the coalition of special envoys, of which I am a part of, just re-adopted in the last July in Argentina. That is the most critical resource to be able to comprehensively identify and combat this strain of anti-Semitism, that is anti-Zionism. And I want to say one last thing about that. In this strain of anti-Semitism, you need not be a Jew to be the target. In this strain of anti-Semitism, because anti-Zionism is this new strain, you need just be identified as or self-identify as a Zionist, someone who believes in Israel's very right to exist. All of those that have actually spoken out, not just in Israel's right to self-defense, which every single country has, but in the demand to seize the demonization and the delegitimization and the application of double standards or invented standards to the Jew among the nations, have been the recipients of this lethal strain of what is an ever mutating hatred.
Michal, you raised a number of very important issues. In our previous conversations, and I know that you have publicly raised an issue of anti-Semitism as a national security issue, as some other special envoys referred to the same thing. When we think about best practices in recent time, right? I mean, you also talked about historical anti-Semitism versus current anti-Semitism. So this disease has been with us for quite a long time, centuries. But when we think about recent best practices, such as global guidelines that the Department of State issued, I think it's a very, very bipartisan issue, which is a good thing. You know, I think Secretary Rubio, if you probably heard of his confirmation hearings, he specifically talked about the importance of standing up to anti-Semitism. So in that sense, when you think about the best practices that governments around the world have adopted in the recent, since October 7th, let's say, what comes to mind, and what is your take on the global guidelines and how effective they are, the ones that State Department released last summer?
Look, the global guidelines with their 12 steps are wonderful, except that they need to be implemented. I mean, you know, the time for words and declarations is surely over when we face this tsunami of anti-Semitism that, by the way, has continued across the world. And I mentioned Sydney, Australia, just 2 nights ago, and so on. But this tsunami of anti-Semitism surely would have died down since we have sort of come to some sort of an arranged ceasefire, so to speak, except that that is not what has happened. What we have seen, in fact, is continued protests, including at Columbia University, that hand out more emboldened, sort of very clear anti-Semitism. And by the way, the IRA working definition has its 11 examples precisely because it enables to identify not only traditional anti-Semitism, so to speak, but the new modern mainstream strains of anti-Semitism, except that we have to be very clear, as with every other virus, just because new strains, resilient strains, are developed, mainstreamed, and normalized, like this strain that denies Israel's right to exist has been normalized, it does not mean that the old strains have passed or have gone or have been eradicated. And so, in fact, what we have seen is that the global guidelines are a great instruction manual, if you will, but it must be implemented, including, and I have to repeat this, the very clear and unequivocal usage of the instrument that enables to identify and combat anti-Semitism. If you don't define something, you can't identify it. And if you don't identify it, you can't combat it. And if you do so selectively, if you identify some strains of the oldest hatred in the world, but not all strains of the oldest hatred in the world, then you'll only be combating it partially. And so the global guidelines do refer to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, but that needs to be implemented. And you know, when we say that anti-Semitism predicts a rising major threat to humanity and to freedom and to the dignity of difference, that is what makes it a national security threat. That's what enables it to predict what endangers all spaces and places in which it thrives and permeates and spreads. But that means that anti-Semitism is not a problem of Jews. It's a problem of anti-Semites. It's a problem of the places and the spaces in which it's allowed to be spread. Just like any other form of hatred, we would never say that anti-Black racism is a problem of Blacks. We would say it's a problem of anti-Black racists. But what we have found, and this has been very challenging, including with the, I'm going to say, not loud enough action to implement existing policies throughout university campuses, on city streets, anywhere where anti-Semitism has raised its ugly head under the banner of being pro-Palestinian. It's not pro-Palestinian to support Hamas. Anybody that supports the Palestinian people would be demonstrating against Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, but one proxy alongside the Houthis and Hezbollah and Iran itself of that murderous Islamic regime in Iran, to be separated from the people of Iran that are subjugated to precisely the same torture and poisoning and executions that their proxies around the world have utilized to actually destroy the societies and the spaces and the countries in which they have taken over from within. And if we think that Western democracies are immune from those radical capabilities to actually from within, and I'm going to say in democracy's case, it's a little different, because you could utilize what we regard as, cherish as the strengths of democracies, you can utilize them as weaknesses to undermine them, whether it's freedom of religion or freedom of speech or freedom of the press. We understand that those freedoms, they were never free. We fought, all of us, very hard to be able to have those freedoms. And now the question is, will we be able to preserve them? In that sense, anti-Semitism predicts what is a national security threat to all countries in which we have seen this unbelievable exponential rise of anti-Semitism in that sense, it is our shared duty and responsibility to confront that anti-Semitism and to do so comprehensively using the IRA working definition. And in that sense, it is a failure of the international institutions, of the human rights organizations, human rights, so to speak, organizations that have actually, as I said, redefined the foundational principles that they were entrusted to uphold, promote, and protect equally and consistently, including the 3 hostages released just a few days ago, sharing only today that they were actually held in UN civilian shelters. That is an indictment to the UN, but not only to the UN. It's an indictment to all of the countries, Western countries, that have enabled these institutions, their agencies like UNRWA. We didn't even delve into UNRWA, an agency born in sin, to care for one group of refugees that hands down refugee status in perpetuity from generation to generation, creating forever refugees. We didn't talk about WHO, the World Health Organization. We didn't talk about the hospitals and the schools that were utilized actually knowingly by those agencies, by this infrastructure of genocidal terror, for whom human tragedy, is the strategy, the human tragedy of their own people, and human tragedy, obviously, of anybody that they care not for or that they openly declare their intent to annihilate, which is, in this case, the state of Israel and Jews around the world. But, you know, what's most important for me, actually, in this moment of reckoning, which I believe is probably the most, I'm going to say, elusive and dangerous part of what continues to be the war of barbarism on civilization, it is that it has turned into a war of attrition. It's going to be much harder to remain committed to combating the axis of evil that openly declares its intent to destroy our shared civilization and build an alternate reality on its rubble. In that sense, anti-Semitism serves as a constant reminder. The fact that it continues to spread and to fester and to rear its ugly head, in many ways, the genie released from the bottle in cities across Western democracies, is our daily reminder that this war is not at all over, and we would be remiss if we thought that it is.
I want to touch on the field of education. You mentioned universities specifically, and it's not just here in the United States, it's sort of a global issue. You know, from last week's discussion, I think there is a broad consensus that education is one of the most critical tools to combat anti-Semitism. However, the challenges we face on campuses, whether in this country, in Europe, Australia, everywhere, where anti-Semitic incidents have risen to an incredible height, that's one issue. The other issue is sort of the school curricula, whether in universities or whether in schools, primary schools, where there has been anti-Semitic rhetoric in that curricula, or it just fails to adequately teach young people to combat and to stand up to hate, to anti-Semitism. So a two-part question for you when it comes to education. The first part, you know, from being in Israel, what do you see as far as Israeli governments or civil society's efforts to work on sort of education systems worldwide? I know we've spoken of a number of NGOs that are active also in the Middle East, but globally, and work on specific education reforms. And second part is, you know, what proactive measures should academic institutions and governments be taken to protect students on campuses, to protect Jewish students on campuses?
Look, I'll start with what I've said to every university president that I met with, including before I was in this role, when I was on a law school speaking tour addressing the combating of anti-Semitism with international law and human rights, and actually way before this war, months before this war, the protests against my speaking on International Holocaust Remembrance Day was Zionists not welcome, with a Zionist coding Jew in that sense, having to cross the threshold, including, you know, at Columbia University Law School, including at NYU. And I want to say what I've said to university presidents since that speaking tour, and obviously since October the 7th, this is a moment of reckoning, because academic institutions and education, you referred to it, as far as I know, our mission is for education, certainly higher education, to teach how to think critical thinking tools, which we need for humanity to advance, for the pursuit of knowledge, and so on. Instead, what we have seen across university spaces, and again, it's not just about anti-Semitism. It's about what anti-Semitism has exposed. It's about the removal of the many masks in the aftermath of October the 7th, including on university campuses and protests and in campuses and so on, is that universities seem to have actually traded in their mission of teaching people how to think with a very scary mission of teaching what to think, so that we have professors who express their exhilaration at the October 7th massacre. We have radical feminists who explain to us that rape is armed resistance. And we now have, for example, at Columbia University, professors who, yes, expressed their support for October the 7th, teaching courses on Zionism. That is a failure of those institutions and of our societies to ensure that academic spaces are indeed committed to teaching critical thinking for the pursuit of knowledge, for the progress of humankind and not the regress of humankind, of which they supported in their protests. With regards to a piece of education that I believe is our sort of most immediate tool that we turn to, and now we're going to be speaking about the 80-year commemorations, which is Holocaust education. And I feel very strongly about this, so I just want to mention it and not to run out of time. Holocaust education that does not teach contemporary anti-Semitism, including the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, that includes the 11 examples, that includes the demonization and the delegitimization and the double standards against the state of Israel, is not only not helpful, it is fueling anti-Semitism. And I want to explain. In that process that I tried to sort of give names to, in that 50-year unconventional war for public opinion that hijacked and weaponized international law institutions and mechanisms and principles, that turned Zionism into racism and Israel into an apartheid state and Israel into a country that perpetrates genocide, it is Israel that is accused of perpetrating a Holocaust. Indeed, it is the Holocaust itself that has been hijacked and weaponized. And imagine how evil you have to be to have not only suffered a Holocaust, but to perpetrate a Holocaust. That is the moment that we meet at. We meet at 80 years to which the Holocaust itself has been weaponized to demonize and delegitimize and apply double standards to the state of Israel, the Jew among the nations, and all who support its right to exist. So that if we don't understand that it's not going to suffice to include Holocaust education curriculum, or that Holocaust museums are not going to be able to live up to their mission of never again, because it's the Holocaust itself that's been hijacked and weaponized by this axis of evil, as I said, genocidal terror proxies of an Islamic republic in Iran that is utilizing this terminology, that's using the terms of human rights, that's using the institutions of courts of last resort like the ICC and the ICJ to allege that it is the Jew among the nations that is perpetrating a Holocaust. And so education is not just something that we have to sort of commit to in theory. The question is, of course, what we are educating to. And in that sense, the pushback against the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which we've seen across places and spaces in Western democracies, in the countries that adopted them, in those that actually recommitted to them in the global guidelines for combating anti-Semitism led by the United States State Department and outgoing Special Envoy Deborah Lipstadt. The pushback that we have seen against IRA is not random. It is part of this hijacking and weaponization of the international principles, mechanisms, institutions, and language. And just as sort of anecdotal evidence, we should know that in countries like Canada, the Ontario School Board has actually adopted a notion or a term which they have coined called anti-Palestinian racism, APR, which essentially negates the IRA. It renders any of us who self-define as Zionists as anti-Palestinian racists by definition. It's a moment in which, if we don't understand not just that we have to educate, but what we're educating to, then we can be fueling not only the tsunami of anti-Semitism, but the undoing or the collapsing of the foundations of our democracies.
Thank you, Michal. You've been on college campuses here in this country and elsewhere. You've spoken to students. First of all, I think global guidelines, they don't need to be limited necessarily to governments. They are simple enough. They could be adopted to schools. They could be adopted to universities. It's sort of a global utilization of these guidelines, no matter what the setting is, actually. When you talk to students, and I'm trying to remember myself as a 20-year-old, in terms of argument of free speech, or in terms of argument of where is the limit of criticism of the policies of the state of Israel, and where is that line when it transforms from criticism alone, which is valid for any government around the world, to being anti-Semitic, right? Where is that line in your opinion?
So, Tim, thank you so much for that question. And I implore that everybody read the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, that before it lists its 11 examples, clearly stipulates what should be obvious, but still it clearly stipulates it, which is that criticism of the state of Israel, or criticism of certain policies or of a certain government of the state of Israel, of course, that's not anti-Semitism, like criticism of any other country. What is anti-Semitism is delegitimization, the denial of Israel's very right to exist. That is what we have seen. There is no country in the world whose very right to exist is called into question. And not only have we seen it in the process that led up to October the 7th, and not only was it what precisely October the 7th meant to symbolize, including the kibbutzim and the cities that were attacked on that day, which some of your viewers may not know, but are of the most peace-loving people in this country, including the likes of 74-year-old Canadian Israeli peace activist Vivian Silver, whose remains it took 5 weeks to identify. In fact, the indication that was very clearly made on October the 7th is the denial of Israel's very right to exist anywhere. And finally, the denial of Israel's very right to exist in the responses to October the 7th, to the war crimes, to the crimes against humanity perpetrated on that day, with an incapability of unequivocally condemning those barbaric atrocities, and with responses of denial that I mentioned before, right? Denial that began to set in, and I want to say in this context of 80 years that we will be marking to the liberation of Auschwitz, 80 years, understanding that denial is the most dangerous step that we should be aware of, because denial allows the repeat. It denies the possibility of never again. Denial of October the 7th began even while the thousands of barbaric savages perpetrating the atrocities of October the 7th were live streaming them. The responses of justification that I mentioned before, right? Rape as armed resistance. And finally, the responses that have attacked Jews around the world, making very clear, or in the chants, that are chanted at me in protests when I come to speak on campus, we don't want no Jew state, we want all of 48, or the echoing of the Hamas Mein Kampf charter from the river to the sea, which we understand when you know the map, that is the entire thing, right? And glory to our martyrs alongside that. So, of course, criticism of the state of Israel is not just allowed. It's not just not anti-Semitism. It's necessary. Israel is a thriving democracy, and all democracies must have criticism in order to evolve, in order to improve. What is anti-Semitism is the denial of Israel's very right to exist, the delegitimization. And that's why that part of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, that so many actually, that's precisely the reason that they oppose to it. The dehumanization, so that you can rip down posters of Kfir Bibas, a baby still in the underground hell of Hamas as we speak today, because that's not a human baby. The delegitimization that denies Israel's very right to exist and the legitimacy of Israel's very right to exist. And finally, the double standards that apply not just in this case, or in the post-October 7th world, not just a double standard that we've seen in the UN systematically over 50 years, that actually accuses Israel of more human rights violations than all countries in the world every single year in its Human Rights Council, but in fact, the double standards that created invented standards applied to the state of Israel with a redefinition of the terminology that was utilized to accuse the state of Israel of genocide, of starvation, of mass deportation, and so on and so on. That's what we have seen since, and that is what makes the IHRA working definition so critically important as an instrument that enables not only to identify and combat what is anti-Semitism, but to identify and combat what is not, or not to combat, to identify what is not anti-Semitism, in this case, criticism of the state of Israel or of certain policies or a certain government.
Thank you, Michal. I want to move to another field that is important, I think, when it comes to combating anti-Semitism, and that's social media, right? So we cannot live without our TikToks on Instagrams, right? Social media continues to be, unfortunately, a powerful amplifier of hate speech as well, and that includes anti-Semitism. While all of the social media platforms continue to be central to free speech and communication, they're also breeding grounds for misinformation and for incitement. In your opinion, how are governments addressing the challenges posed by social media platforms as far as spreading anti-Semitism is concerned? And are there examples of successful collaboration with tech companies to tackle this issue?
So I'll share, and you mentioned that when I was in Knesset, I founded an interparliamentary bipartisan task force to combat online anti-Semitism. But actually, it was at the time of COVID, and there was this huge spike in online anti-Semitism, and recognizing, well, first of all, that what happens online does not remain online. And second of all, that this is a global challenge in a global reality, and that social media platforms have created a new way in which we consume information, but we have not adjusted the ways in which we consume that information. In fact, it prompted me to found that interparliamentary task force to combat online anti-Semitism. And I want to say something. Look, in a post-October 7th world, I often describe it as an intersection between the multiple fronts in which anti-Semitism has been raging. I mentioned the international institutions and human rights organizations in which not only have these principles been hijacked and weaponized, but they've actually emboldened genocidal terror proxies of murderous regimes. We mentioned the university campuses in which we've seen this tsunami of anti-Semitism explosive and almost systemically. By the way, I didn't mention in that context the imperative to follow the money, the imperative to understand that foreign funding has actually enabled and emboldened this takeover of the hearts and minds, including in academic institutions in the United States of America. And finally, the third sort of war front, if you will, in a digital age is the online platforms. And I won't even delve into the implications with AI. The social media platforms, and I think that this is a much longer conversation, maybe it'll merit my visit to the Wilson Center. The social media platforms have benefited from what I actually think is a wrong assumption. And it is that they are a free speech model, that it is a Hyde Park situation in which you and I can walk by somebody giving a speech, standing on a soapbox, and we can decide if we want to listen or not. Except that is not the business model of social media platforms. My echo chamber, if you will, or my feed looks very different than your echo chamber or your feed. There is an algorithm, and none of us know what it is because there's no transparency, and governments have failed to actually hold social media to account to create that transparency so that you and I know why I am seeing certain information and why you're seeing other information. And in this current business model that polarizes and fragmentizes in order to keep eyeballs engaged, it's a business model. It's not evil. It's business. It's making money. It's not free speech. It's very expensive speech. In that case, what we have sort of assumed to be the understanding of what shouting fire needlessly in a crowded theater means is not necessarily, and I'm going to maybe even argue necessarily not, what it means in a social media reality. Shouting fire needlessly in a crowded theater, in a reality of TikTok and X and Facebook and Instagram, and those are just those that we've engaged with productively, in our conversations, including as legislators, does not mean the same thing as it did when we were in a physical theater and somebody shouted fire needlessly. And now we can talk about what it is that in a social media reality we need to do in order to prevent that sort of repeat offense that we are experiencing day after day after day. And what we are doing up till now is just playing whack-a-mole. Governments, legislators, I'm going to say we think we're the consumers, but actually we're the product. Those of us that are the product on social media platforms are actually over and over again responding, reacting, so that when we are satisfied or not satisfied, for example, by content moderators, 40,000 content moderators or 10,000 content moderators or no content moderators at all, that's really almost, I'm going to say, irrelevant. I don't want Facebook or X or Instagram deciding for me what I can and cannot say. What I want is transparency. Transparency of algorithm, transparency of policy, and transparency of the implementation of policy. Now, the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism that began its discussion with very senior individuals in those social media platforms in Israel's Knesset in 2020, then continued its work, and we actually held a hearing in the US Congress, then we held a hearing in the European Parliament, and we came to this sort of understanding that we were going to create this accountability mechanism together, because this is a global challenge. I have to sadly say that the Interparliamentary Task Force did not continue its work in the same way of a continued conversation with the social media platforms that actually came to the recognition that what we need to be creating are transparency mechanisms. And I understand, they're not going to tell us the recipe, the secret sauce, if you will, but there are models, let's say, of public trusts that need to be created so that what we have is transparency. And I'm not sure that any government is well on the way to that. There is sort of the DSA that was passed in Europe and maybe begins to hold to account at a higher level. But again, if the understanding is that we don't want more content moderation or less content moderation, what we should be asking for is transparency, then there needs to be a global concerted effort to have that kind of conversation.
So to the best of your knowledge, Michal, when it comes to conversations with senior executives in companies like Meta or Google or Alphabet, is that something that has been already done? Is that something that should continue into 2025 and beyond? Because again, as you said, what we have here is sort of a clash between desire for free speech and freedom of expression and the hate content, right? So what you are asking for is the importance of transparency, but it needs to be taken to this higher level, CEO level conversations with the tech companies around the world.
You are 100% right, Tim. Absolutely, the conversation has to continue. I should mention that we held a conversation of this kind with senior execs in the State Department, recognizing that actually what we see in an online space can actually lead to what we regard as national security threats, using the online spaces by very negative agents and so on. Of course, the conversation with the social media platforms must continue. And as you said, in many ways, it's not just a conversation at this point that is critical, obviously, for combating anti-Semitism or identifying and combating anti-Semitism. I would be remiss if I didn't mention in this regard that at the very least, at some point, in this sort of, if you can't beat them, join them, or the lawyer in me that, sort of said, well, we can make sort of two sort of arguments at the same time, knowing that social media platforms have what they call protected characteristics. At the very least, there was a conversation that we held with them for adding Zionist as a protected characteristic when it came to anti-Semitism, recognizing that Zionism replaces Jew, recognizing that you could say absolutely anything you want about a Zionist, except that it is my identity. I can't just shed as a Zionist, whether I'm a Jew or a non-Jew, I can't just shed my Zionist pound of flesh in order to be a good human being. And in that sense, Zionist in some ways was added, including to Meta, as some sort of a protected characteristic that in some contexts can't be utilized. But that is just sort of the whack-a-mole or reactive engagement that we have had with the social media platforms. It has been insufficient, as we've clearly seen, including, well, I invite anybody here to just look at my own sort of, whether it's on X or any other of the social media platforms that I'm on, with virulent anti-Semitism, by the way, in all its forms, traditional and new. All forms intersect because none of them go away. And finally, yes, you're 100% right that this can and must be done with continued engagement with very senior level executives that recognize that the way that we consume information, just as it changed with the advent of the print press, the way that we consume information has changed radically, but the way we consume information hasn't changed at all. And that actually enables very negative agents to actually abuse free speech and the notions of free speech that we assume exist, and create this dissemination of disinformation and misinformation and just pure unbridled lies.
Felix Klein, your German counterpart, talked about the recent legislation passed in German Bundestag, and some of it looks into sort of online propaganda and hate and holds these organizations accountable for what they put online. In terms of sort of looking forward, in terms of legislative or regulatory framework, what would you like to see adopted to sort of hold the social media tech companies accountable for anti-Semitic propaganda?
So in many ways, I think that we have to, as legislators, we have no choice but to also be reactive, except that the advent of technology is much faster than legislators. It's why I do believe that at the end of the day, without creating transparency mechanisms, we will always be chasing our tails, if you will. We'll always be playing whack-a-mole, knocking down one head or removing 1,000 pieces of content when 1 million others or 1 million people have already been exposed to them. For me, the sort of most important principle, and by the way, it applies with any other corporation when we imagine how it is that corporations interact with the public, it is transparency. I mentioned before, transparency of algorithm, transparency of policies, and transparency of the implementation of those policies. So that what I would require, for example, just to translate that into something anecdotal, is that when you have a 16-year-old engaged in what's known as point of view videos that are Holocaust denial, literal Holocaust denial, I don't want that content removed from TikTok or wherever they're posting that point of view video, or X, or any other, sort of platform that's being utilized. If you remove that content, you've actually done nothing. We spoke about education. You've done nothing to educate the 16-year-old that doesn't not just not know what Holocaust denial is. That 16-year-old doesn't even know what the Holocaust was, right? That's where we're at. And so the expectation that I would have that governments need to create mechanisms for is actually for that content to be flagged and to have to click through, for example, through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that not only explains what Holocaust denial is, but explains what the Holocaust was. So that when we are met with this removal of content, censorship, if you will, or free speech, we're actually not addressing what it is that we've touched upon in this entire conversation, not just regarding anti-Semitism, but regarding the way in which we consume information, the way in which young people consume or don't consume information, consume disinformation. That is where I very much hope we'll be able to sort of take the next higher level of conversation in terms of transparency, responsibility, and accountability.
Finally, I'd like to explore the role of international collaboration in combating anti-Semitism. You alluded to it in your remarks. This is truly a global challenge. It's something that not a single country can address alone. My first question is sort of in terms of multilateral engagements. You put some criticism on UN. I have to tell you that, in one experience that I had, and sort of to put one positive plug on the UN system, in my conversations with colleagues from UNESCO, who work on there is a specific program on combating anti-Semitism in education that UNESCO is working with governments around the world, not just in terms of Holocaust denial, but specifically in contemporary anti-Semitism, in trying to ensure that this is a part of educational curriculum around the world and trying to actually get into MENA region as well. I think that's important, and I think that it's positive sign that such program exists, and UNESCO officials for that specific program are working with governments around the world. But when you look at organizations such as the UN, such as OSCE, Council of Europe, we had OSCE and Council of Europe officials with us last week, how can they play a stronger role in sort of uniting nations against anti-Semitism?
So in a post-October 7th world, including all of those very important initiatives that you mentioned, without the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and I had meetings, including in the UN with the individuals mandated to create a strategy, a national strategy, internal strategy for the UN for combating anti-Semitism. I'm going to repeat again that without defining something, we can't identify it. And without identifying it, we can't combat it. And there is one single definition that allows to comprehensively identify all strains of what is an ever mutating lethal virus, and that is the IHRA working definition. It's a working definition, I often say, and not legally binding, because devastatingly, as far as I'm concerned, as I said, anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred in the world that has actually mutated over thousands of years. And where we thought, or maybe thought, that it died in Auschwitz, it didn't. It just developed a new, very lethal strain in the strain of anti-Zionism, or the denial of Israel's right to exist. So all of those countries and institutions and initiatives that are genuinely committed to combating anti-Semitism have to do so comprehensively, including the recognition of Israel's very right to exist, including the recognition that Zionist is integral to the identity of the majority of Jews who can't just shed their Zionist pound of flesh, and many non-Jews who believe deeply in the right of the state of Israel to exist. And those organizations too, and of course the Coalition of Special Envoys, of which I am a member, have a critical role in global collaboration in understanding that, as I said before, and I deeply believe this, anti-Semitism is not a problem of Jews or the Jewish nation state. It is a problem of anti-Semites and of all of the places and spaces that allow them to spread and infect with this lethal, ever mutating hate that predicts what is a major threat to humanity and to dignity and to freedom. And in that sense, it is international collaboration, and perhaps only international collaboration, that can rise to this tremendous challenge. But it has to do it openly. It has to do it candidly. It has to do it comprehensively. It can't do it by leaving out Israel from the conversation, because Israel was created after thousands of years in which a prototypical indigenous people who speak the same language, Hebrew, and traverse the same land, Israel, and practice the same customs and rituals, and read the same Bible that was desecrated on October the 7th, returned to an ancestral homeland. That's not only what our Declaration of Independence says, that is the Jewish story. That is the reason for the existence of the State of Israel. The State of Israel does not exist because the Holocaust occurred, as we mark 80 years to the end of World War II. The State of Israel does not exist because the Holocaust occurred. Anybody peddling that lie is fueling anti-Semitism. The State of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, as I referred to, that prototypical indigenous people. It doesn't mean that there can't be other indigenous peoples. It means that we have to recognize the Jewish people as an indigenous people in an ancestral homeland. And not only does the State of Israel not exist because the Holocaust occurred, but it's precisely the opposite. A Holocaust could not have occurred had the State of Israel existed. At the very least, we would have defended ourselves, which is precisely what October the 7th has taught and continues teaching us, as we are embroiled in this continued multi-front war, openly intent to annihilate Israel. As I said, it hasn't gone away. We would be remiss if we thought that it has. And in that sense, I think that we are at an existential moment, not only for the State of Israel, not only for Jews and Zionists who support a right to exist around the world, but indeed for our shared civilization, in the midst of, and we would be remiss if we didn't zoom out and understand, in the midst of what is a raging war of barbarism on civilization, of which Israel is just on the front lines of, or the Jew among the nations is just, if you will, the scapegoat of precisely how anti-Semitism has worked for thousands of years.
So, Michal, just one final question on this topic in terms of successful partnerships, whether bilateral or multilateral. Our former special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, Dr. Lipstadt, one of her first trips in her tenure was to the Middle East. One of her last trips was to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. The importance of engaging sort of globally and specifically talking to countries in the Middle East. Have you had an opportunity to do that? How important it is? Thank you.
So not only do I think it's important, I think it is actually a great source of hope, and I'll explain. I was a member of Knesset, of Israel's parliament, in 2020 when we signed the Abraham Accords, of course, with many of those countries. The understanding that the Abraham Accords actually represented a historic pivot, a shift from the 1973 three no's of Khartoum, almost simultaneous to the 1975 Zionism is racism. The 1973, I believe, three no's of Khartoum said no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, and no to peace with Israel. Well, in 2020, in the Abraham Accords, there was a potential flip of that paradigm that said yes to recognition of Israel, yes to negotiation with Israel, then yes to paving the path to peace with Israel. The flipping from the three no's to the three yeses of the Abraham Accords, to recognition, to negotiation, and to peace in that order, actually have the potential to pave the path to peace for all peoples of the region. An extension of that Abraham Accord understanding that recognizing Israel's right to exist, just as we would expect mutual recognition before we're able to negotiate the terms of our coexistence, enable that negotiation, which then are the tool or the mechanism to pave the path to peace, are the most awe-inspiring and hopeful understanding as we advance forward. And therefore, as an indication of how deep that, I'm going to say, paradigmal shift was in those Abraham Accord countries, and some of countries that didn't actually join yet, but potentially would and hopefully will, we have seen actually surprising quiet or lack of support and even condemnation of the October 7 massacre, precisely from those countries, as opposed to the responses in democracies, some of which I mentioned. So for me, that is a great deal of hope that is actually sort of very much represented in the understanding of those countries, that what anti-Semitism enables to predict is radicalism. It doesn't matter if that radicalism comes from the extremities on the right, the extremities on the left, or the extremities of Islam, or any other extremity. That radicalization and radicalism is what endangers the moderate majority public that seeks and that cherishes life and liberty. And in fact, it is those countries precisely from which I've drawn a great deal of hope, including over the last 16 months in personal outreach messages and also in public outreach messages and conduct that we have seen over the last 16 months. And I very much hope that actually with this incoming administration, we can see a continuation of that recognition of that pivot from the three no's to the three yeses that I believe was inherent to the Abraham Accords, and also enables to address what we discussed in the way that anti-Semitism has manifested and mainstreamed since October the 7th, right? Recognition of Israel's very right to exist. It's there, it's integral to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, but doing so because it is the interest of all of those countries is the best possible way that we can imagine that that will be advanced, and allows us actually in many ways, hopefully, to realize the potential that that paradigm shift represented as we look forward for all peoples of the region and beyond. And I have to say, because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, including, of course, the Palestinians, except that I've just noted what it is that needs to happen, including with the Palestinians. Recognition is the first step that enables negotiation, that paves the path to peace. That is the flipping of what we've been told for decades. Make peace, and then We'll negotiate the terms of that peace, and then we'll see if they recognize your right to exist. That is true not only for the genocidal terror entities that we have seen, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and all of them proxies of a murderous Islamic regime in Iran. That is actually true for the Palestinian Authority that continues to peddle blood libel and anti-Semitism, that continues to indoctrinate with UNRWA school books of traditional and new Mein Kampf anti-Semitism, that continues to pay for the slay of Jews. So in many ways, that flipping of the three no's to the three S's, recognition, negotiation, and peace, are actually the way forward for all peoples in the region and beyond, that I very much hope are represented, including in this year of 2025, as we mark all of the important dates that we are commemorating, and certainly 80 years to the end of World War II.
Michal, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for your thoughtful insights today. Just to for our audience to summarize key takeaways from our conversation today. I think we agree that the need for global leadership, for shared responsibility, that's very important. As you said, denial is most dangerous. Denial allows repeat. So combating anti-Semitism is not a challenge any single nation can tackle alone. It requires coordination across governments, across international organizations, across civil society. We talked about education as a cornerstone for a long-term challenge. It remains one of the most powerful tools we have to address anti-Semitism at its roots. Protecting free speech is essential, but as we said, social media companies, tech companies need to commit to transparency in their in the way they function. And then finally, sort of the role of governments, institutions, and individuals. We all have a vital role to play in the fight against anti-Semitism, whether it's through policy, advocacy, or personal responsibility. To our audience, thank you for being part of this vital conversation. Today's conversation was especially significant as we mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It serves, as always, as a powerful reminder of the lessons of history and the responsibility we all share to combat hatred and protect human dignity. The fight against anti-Semitism requires all of us to stand together, and we look forward to continuing these conversations, these discussions as part of a broader commitment to justice, tolerance, and remembrance. Thank you for joining us here at the Wilson Center.
This video was produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. If you'd like to see more, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. There you'll find in-depth discussions and research on important global issues and topics. And thanks for watching.